In 2010, Coldwater Spring was officially transferred to the National Park Service. The buildings from the Bureau of Mines era were to be torn down, and the area was going to be restored and preserved as a park. In 2006, the National Park Service hired a consulting agency by the name of Two Pines Group to conduct a large-scale ethnographic study about the property. They wanted to find out more about its history before 1820 and Camp Coldwater. An important part of that study and analysis was to figure out whether Coldwater Spring was and still is a sacred site to the Dakota, worthy of protection under the guidelines defined on the National Register of Historic Places.
So we did a big study, an ethnography that looked at the site as an ethnographic site, as a sacred site, and as a traditional cultural property. After we reviewed that data and looked at the documentation that supported this being a traditional cultural property, a property that had been used by a tribe, a specific people, for a length of time for specific purposes, the documentation is not there to support it.
The study included an 1837 map, testimony by Dakota elders, and the consulting group's own historical research. They concluded that the site was indeed a traditional cultural property, or TCP, considered sacred by the Dakota and thus worthy of protection under the guidelines set aside by the National Register. The Park Service disagreed. This issue about Coldwater Spring being a sacred site has proven to be an inflammatory one.
That's the complication of this place, is that we're being told by some tribes it's significant. We're being told by some individuals it's significant and sacred. We're being told by others that it's not, and not to treat it that way. And what we're seeing is this is a tremendously divisive issue within the Dakota communities themselves. One, we're not privileged to look behind the curtain at, and I don't want to.
After the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, Dakota people suffered from the loss of their land. Many were exiled, never to return to Minnesota, the place they considered their homeland. As a result, many people like Jim Anderson spent a lot of time finding out who they were and reconnecting with their Dakota heritage and history. Another casualty of this war is a loss of culture, a loss of stories, as Bruce White and Jim Anderson explain.
So it wasn't until the construction of Highway 55 that, some of the Dakota people started talking about how that was an important place. But they'll say, you talk to Dakota people and they'll say that they knew of the site and they recognized its importance. But to expect that Dakota people would talk about their sacred sites freely with non-Dakota is asking a lot, considering the history of how the Dakota were treated.
Well, we've been in institutions, until 1978, it was against federal law for us to practice our spirituality at all. And a lot of these places, because of those type of policies of the U.S. government to kill the Indian, save the child, they took us to boarding schools. My great-grandmother went to a boarding school, and the Indian and the culture were beat out of us. So we didn't know. But this is where our creation stories come from. That's exactly where the rivers come together. And if you look from the satellites, our people called this place, we were the center of the earth people. And if you look from the satellites, we call North America Turtle Island. And we're the exact center of Turtle Island right there where we are.
Native people also point out another factor to be considered when asking for documentation and talking about Native traditions. Practicing your ceremonies and Native religion was outlawed up until 1978 when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed. Upper Sioux tribal member Yvonne Leith remembers traveling to relatives' homes where ceremonies were to be performed. People would be covering the windows so that no one would know what was going on. A drum, a pipe, and other objects were cautiously taken out.
One thing I want to always make clear to people who are telling the story about Coldwater Springs is that we did not get our right to practice our traditional ceremonies until passing of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. I was raised also during a time when the church was very much influenced in our communities. We had no choice. We had to accept Christianity for our own survival. However, as a small child, and now I'm 73 years old, I can remember my parents and other relatives sneaking off to ceremonies late at night. I can remember the feeling of knowing that we were trying to hide or something, because I was a small child. I can remember those feelings as we drove up into the hills.
Yvonne Leith says that Native people rely on oral traditions, not on written documents.
So yes, we're very much aware of that, and even though there may not be tangible proof of the sacredness of these areas, we have our oral history, our stories handed down through families, through the generations, to these places where we fasted, we prayed, and sought visions as part of our traditional ways.
Native people aren't the only ones saying that there is a clash between what they see are different worlds and ways of knowing history and information. One of these people is the Minnesota Historical Society's own Pat Emerson.
It isn't necessary to have what we would look at from a Western view as firm scientific data. We should be able to get beyond the bounds of our own thinking once in a while and understand the value of other forms of knowledge.